At exactly 2:56 a.m. on February 14, 2000, the city never slept. But it blinked, just once. A fog crawled across the East River, shrouding the steel bones of the Brooklyn Bridge in a veil of silence. It wasn't unusual for New York to be quiet in those hours, but this quiet felt different. It felt like something had paused the world. Officer Ronnie Smith was on duty, Sector 4, Foot Patrol. The bridge was his beat, a long stretch of concrete and iron that linked boroughs but held more secrets than stories. He was a recognizable figure in that part of the city, not just for the uniform but for the way he filled it. Broad chest, arms that looked chiseled from granite, and a thick old-school mustache that gave him the kind of presence that made people nod respectfully when he walked by. At 43, Ronnie looked more like a professional wrestler than a beat cop, but everyone knew he was steady, unshakable. He always carried two things: his badge clipped to the chest of his jacket, polished, never scratched, and an old, scuffed baseball. He flipped it into the air whenever he was thinking. When tension crept into his mind, the baseball danced in his palm. He once told his brother Robbie, his identical twin, that the rhythm of the ball kept his thoughts from spiraling. That night everything was normal until it wasn't. Ronnie's last radio check-in was logged at 2:51 a.m. Routine. Calm voice. No signs of distress. The next 5 minutes, however, disappeared. No outgoing calls. No response. At 3:04 a.m., dispatch tried to reach him again. Nothing. At 3:10 a.m., a fellow officer driving past the bridge noticed Ronnie's cruiser idling with the engine running. Lights off. Driver's side door closed. He approached, calling out. No answer. The cruiser was empty. Ronnie was gone. But the weirdest part, and the part that still haunts anyone who reviewed the scene, was what was left behind. On the middle walkway, just a few feet from the railing, lay his baseball. Still. Perfectly placed. Not dropped. Not rolling. As if someone had set it down gently. And next to it, a half-drunk thermos of coffee, the cap unscrewed, still warm. There was no badge, no jacket, just that ball. By 5 a.m., the bridge was closed to the public. Helicopters circled overhead. Divers hit the water. K-9 units swept the length of the bridge. But there was no sign of Ronnie. No blood. No torn fabric. No sounds reported by anyone crossing during those hours. Security footage from the surveillance camera on the Manhattan side showed Ronnie walking north on the pedestrian path at 2:49 a.m. Then the camera went static, 34 seconds of digital snow, and returned to show an empty frame. No sign of him. No one entering or leaving. Just fog. Robbie was asleep when he got the knock on his door. He opened it to two officers, their faces already saying what their mouths hadn't. He didn't ask questions. Didn't speak. He just stared at them, then turned to the hallway behind him, where Ronnie's framed photo hung, both of them at age 20, in matching uniforms on graduation day. Ronnie smiling wide. Robbie always more serious. Robbie didn't cry. He got in the car and asked to be taken to the bridge. When he arrived, he saw the baseball under a cone. He didn't move toward it, just stood there, arms crossed. His face unreadable. He looked like Ronnie. Same build, same mustache, same jawline. But something in his eyes already looked older. That day was the last day Robbie believed in routine. The investigation began with force. Flyers went up. Detectives pulled shifts like clockwork. Tips came in. The Smith family was interviewed constantly. The press speculated everything from suicide to undercover operations gone wrong. But none of it made sense. Ronnie didn't run. He didn't hide. He was methodical, predictable. He didn't vanish. Robbie moved into Ronnie's apartment the same week. He said it was temporary, but months passed. Then years. He kept the place exactly as it was. The coffee cup on the sink. The black jacket over the chair. The Yankees cap still hanging by the door. He went through his brother's things again and again, looking for something that might explain it. A letter. A journal. Anything. But all he found was order. Clean drawers. Organized shelves. No secrets. He sat on the edge of Ronnie's bed at night, tossing that same baseball into the air, catching it like Ronnie used to. He started carrying it with him, rubbing his thumb along the seam. It became his connection, his ritual. The bridge was never the same after that. For Robbie, it became a symbol of pause, of the moment life split into two timelines, one where Ronnie still existed, and one where he didn't. And he lived trapped between them. not knowing which was true. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, but the silence never changed, and neither did Robbie's routine. For the first few weeks, the search for Ronnie Smith felt more like a movement than an investigation. Officers who had trained with him, neighbors who knew his voice from block patrols, and strangers who had only seen his silhouette on the bridge all came forward. Tips poured in. Phone lines were flooded. Search dogs were dispatched along the riverbanks while divers combed through the dark waters below the Brooklyn Bridge day after day. Police boats zigzagged endlessly, their searchlights cutting into the current like scalpels. Nothing. Flyers with Ronnie's face, square jaw, piercing eyes, unmistakable mustache, were plastered across lower Manhattan. In some, he wore his uniform. In others, it was a photo from a precinct barbecue, holding a plate of ribs, his arm slung casually around his twin brother Robbie. You could barely tell them apart, except Ronnie always smiled wider. At press conferences, the department assured the public they were doing everything, every angle, every possible lead. But behind closed doors, theories swirled. Some whispered he'd snapped under the pressure. Others thought he'd gone undercover, buried deep in an operation too sensitive to reveal. But none of it held. Ronnie was steady, predictable, devoted. He wasn't a man who vanished. Robbie stopped listening to the theories after the third week. He had his own. He moved into Ronnie's apartment permanently. At first, he told himself it was to maintain the space in case his brother returned. But over time, it became something else. An anchor. A shrine. He never changed a thing. The coffee mug, still in the sink. The jacket, draped on the back of the kitchen chair. A half-read copy of The Natural on the nightstand, spine cracked at chapter 11. Ronnie's cologne, cedarwood and steel, still lingered on the bathroom towels. Each day, Robbie followed a ritual. He woke at 5 a.m. like Ronnie used to. He brewed the same coffee, wore the same brand of boots, walked to the bridge and stood at the same spot where the baseball had been found. Most days he brought that same ball, rescued from the evidence box after weeks of pestering. He flipped it in his hand, tossed it in the air, caught it without looking. People passing by began to recognize him. The silent twin, the ghost brother. On the first anniversary, Robbie held a candlelight vigil at the bridge. A few officers came, a couple reporters. He barely spoke, only reading a short poem about the tides, something Ronnie had underlined in a library book once. But the words stuck in everyone's throat. On the second anniversary, he stood alone. By the third, people stopped asking. The department closed the case officially after 5 years, declared Ronnie missing under unexplained circumstances. No body, no crime, no closure. His badge was boxed. His name was removed from active duty lists, but Robbie never accepted it. He kept a wall in the apartment covered in maps, receipts, photos, anything that might reveal something missed. A receipt from a deli Ronnie stopped at before his shift. A blurry image from a tourist's disposable camera, taken minutes before 3 a.m., showing what might have been a shadow at the far end of the bridge. He pinned it next to an old photo of them as kids, holding hands in front of a Little League scoreboard. Time passed, but memory didn't. Robbie didn't date, didn't travel. He worked odd jobs, warehouse security, nighttime deliveries, anything that kept him moving through the same hours Ronnie once did. He became known in the neighborhood as the Watcher. Some people pitied him, others avoided him. A few admired the devotion, even if they couldn't understand it. On Ronnie's would-be 50th birthday, Robbie set a place for him at the kitchen table. Steak, medium rare, a small chocolate cake, 2 beers. He sat there, the only sound the ticking of a cheap wall clock. When he looked at the chair across from him, he could almost see his brother sitting there, tossing that baseball up and down, a half smile on his lips. But the chair stayed empty. Year after year, Robbie marked the date. February 14th. It wasn't Valentine's Day for him. It was the day the city went quiet. He wrote letters to Ronnie on that date, dozens of them, some angry, some broken, some filled with nothing but silence. He never mailed them, just folded them neatly and placed them in a shoebox under the bed. At night, he sometimes dreamed Ronnie was still walking that bridge, just out of sight, always 30 steps ahead. He'd call out in the dream, but Ronnie never turned around. The apartment began to feel like a museum, dust on untouched furniture, photographs aging under yellowing light, the badge case unopened on the shelf, his uniform still hanging in the back of the closet, as if waiting for one more shift. Robbie aged. His hair thinned, his hands grew slower, but the search never left him. It just turned inward. Less about finding Ronnie's body, and more about understanding how someone so solid, so grounded, could simply evaporate. Some nights, he would walk the bridge alone, listening to the river below, listening for anything. A whisper, a footstep, the faint sound of a baseball hitting a calloused palm. But all he ever heard was the wind. In the early spring of 2021, New York was beginning to thaw. The city had endured a difficult winter, and the East River, still steel-gray and sluggish, carried along with it the detritus of the season. The currents were high, restless. The Brooklyn Bridge, now fortified with updated surveillance and anti-jumper barriers, still bore its silent scars. Tourists came and went. Commuters passed without pause. But the spot where Ronnie had disappeared had become invisible to everyone, except one. Robbie still walked there twice a week. He no longer carried the baseball. His hands had grown stiff with age, and the toss no longer felt right. But he still stood in the same place, leaned against the same rail, listened to the same wind. That morning, just before 7 a.m., he was drinking his coffee on the bridge's north side when he noticed police tape fluttering a few blocks down, near the Manhattan side underpass. Emergency vehicles were scattered along the Riverwalk. An officer he vaguely recognized was speaking into a radio, while two workers from the sanitation department gestured toward a clump of river debris caught between the retaining wall and a metal outflow pipe. Robbie didn't approach. He stood silently and watched. But something in the posture of the workers, something in the stillness that overtook them when they uncovered what lay trapped in the logs, sent a cold flush down his spine. That night, a knock came at his door. It wasn't official. No uniform. Just a quiet voice. Detective Janice Alvarez, who had once been a rookie during Ronnie's search, now gray at the temples, eyes sharp but kind. She held a plastic evidence bag. Inside, wet, darkened by years in the current, was a folded navy blue police jacket. The fabric was torn slightly at the collar. The badge number was still barely visible under the corrosion. 6173. Robbie sat down slowly. He hadn't seen that number in 2 decades. He'd memorized it, repeated it in his sleep. He used to punch it into old search logs every month, hoping something would light up. But seeing it again, right there in his living room, was like opening a wound sealed over with silence. Alvarez said nothing more. She simply placed the bag on the table and stepped back. But she hesitated before leaving, then reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a second item, a small, beaten-up leather keychain. The Yankees logo had long since faded, but stitched along the edge was a child's name, faint but legible, R. Smith, Jr. It was a gift Ronnie had given Robbie back in high school, a matching set. Robbie had lost his years ago in a subway station, but Ronnie had kept his. It had been inside the jacket pocket. The next morning, Robbie returned to the bridge. The city moved around him, fast and indifferent. But as he stood above the place where the jacket had surfaced, something inside him shifted. For the first time in 2 decades, the fog didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a window, thick, murky, but with something on the other side. Over the next several days, forensic teams combed the shoreline. The jacket had been caught in a submerged drain pipe for what looked like years, only recently loosened by the season's flooding. No other items were recovered. No human remains. Just fragments of dark cloth, buttons, and mud-caked gravel. But for Robbie, it was enough. He brought the baseball out again, placed it on the table beside the jacket. For hours, he just looked at the two objects, like pieces of an old map. His apartment had long since turned into a museum of memory. But this was different. This was new. Or rather, this was something lost, returning. The baseball, the jacket, the keychain, together again, like a quiet sentence finally completed. Late one night, Robbie opened one of Ronnie's old drawers, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside, beneath a stack of precinct forms, was a photo neither of them had framed. It was from 1982. Both brothers side by side sitting on the edge of a dock in Long Island, fishing poles in hand. No mustaches yet, no uniforms, just 2 boys looking out at the water. Robbie took the photo, the baseball, and the badge number and laid them out on the kitchen table. Then he made a decision. He walked to the precinct the next day with the items in a bag and asked to speak privately with Alvarez. When they sat down, He didn't ask for an investigation. He didn't ask for autopsies or forensic teams. All he said was, "Tell me everything you didn't tell me 21 years ago." Alvarez took a long breath. She admitted there were whispers back then, rumors of internal misconduct, officers possibly involved in side operations that brushed up against federal lines. Nothing proven, nothing pursued. But Ronnie had once requested reassignment from Bridge Patrol 3 weeks before his disappearance. It was denied without explanation. The form had been buried. Robbie listened without anger. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask for names. He simply nodded, then took the bag back into his hands. He went home, placed the jacket on a hanger and let it dry by the window. The sun hit it in slanted beams, lighting up the faint golden badge numbers. Then he took the baseball and placed it back into the drawer where it had always belonged. For the first time in 2 decades, he closed that drawer without hesitation. The jacket hung in the window for nearly a week. The sun did its slow work, pulling moisture from the fabric thread by thread, but the damage of 21 years submerged could not be undone. It remained darkened, warped at the seams, and stiff with a salt-stitched crust. But for Robbie, it was sacred. Every blemish was a memory. Every tear was a word unsaid. He didn't touch it, not for days. He simply passed it in the morning like someone passing a grave. Quiet. A nod. A breath held. Then, one night, he sat across from it with the lights off. Just the orange haze of the city leaking through the blinds. He stared until his eyes burned, until the jacket almost looked like someone standing there. And then he spoke. "I didn't keep going because I thought you were alive," he whispered. "I kept going because I didn't know how to stop." The apartment was silent. "I thought that if I found out what happened, I'd find you, or at least, what was left of you inside me." He stood slowly, walked to the window, and lifted the jacket from the hanger with both hands. The fabric made a soft cracking sound, like paper long forgotten. He laid it carefully across the couch and sat beside it, staring at the crooked collar, the faint outline where a name tag used to be. Then he reached into the pocket. There was something else, not the keychain. That had been removed at evidence. This was something else, a slip of folded, nearly disintegrated paper, wedged deep into the lining. He handled it like glass, unfolding it inch by inch. It was a handwritten note. The ink was water-blurred, words half erased, but some lines survived. "Can't stay silent anymore. Not sure who to trust. If I disappear, it wasn't my choice. Tell Robbie I'm sorry." That last line hit like a freight train. Robbie read it over and over, each time slower than the last. The words weren't a confession, they were a warning. Or maybe a goodbye. But more than anything, they were confirmation that Ronnie had been scared, that he hadn't left willingly, and that someone somewhere had known. The next day, Robbie took the note to Alvarez. She read it with her mouth pressed in a thin, regretful line. Then she looked up at him and said, "You want me to reopen the case?" Robbie didn't answer, because for the first time he wasn't sure. What would justice even look like 21 years later? Who would it serve? Ronnie wasn't coming back. And the jacket, the baseball, the note, they weren't keys to a locked door. They were pieces of a door that had already been broken down. That evening, he walked the bridge again. It had changed. New railings, reinforced walkways, more cameras, more noise. But the spot, the exact spot, was still there. He leaned over the railing, the East River below swirling thick and opaque. He took the note from his pocket, held it gently, then let it go. It didn't fall fast. It fluttered, catching wind, tumbling like a dead leaf until it vanished beneath the surface. He didn't feel relief. Not quite, but something in his shoulders relaxed. Later that week, Robbie packed a small bag. He bought a one-way ticket to a town upstate they had once visited as kids. Cold Spring, a quiet place. Water, trees, nothing urgent. He didn't tell anyone. He left a short message on Alvarez's voicemail. "Thank you for not forgetting. Keep the jacket." In the apartment, he left behind everything. The maps, the newspaper clippings, the photographs pinned to the wall. He didn't throw them away. He just didn't need to carry them anymore. Before leaving, he took one last item, Ronnie's baseball, and slipped it into his coat pocket. He didn't know if he would ever come back, but he knew this. He was no longer chasing a shadow. He was walking beside it. And for now, that was enough. For several weeks, the jacket remained at the precinct, stored in a climate-controlled evidence locker. Detective Alvarez had submitted the handwritten note for analysis, though no one expected a miracle. 21 years of water damage had rendered most of the ink unreadable, and the few legible fragments had already spoken their truth. Still, something about the tone of the letter unsettled her. It wasn't just the words. It was the fear between them. Alvarez reopened the personnel file of Officer Ronnie Smith. She had to dig through archives, scan microfiches, even call a retired sergeant who now lived in Arizona. The deeper she looked, the more she found missing. His request for reassignment in January 2000? No official denial form, just a red line scribbled across the top. Unnecessary. C chain. But there was no attached explanation. No internal memos. And oddly, Ronnie's end-of-shift logs from the 2 weeks prior to his disappearance were gone, vanished from the digital archive, with no record of who accessed them last. Alvarez sent a formal inquiry to the department's Internal Affairs Division. She didn't expect much. Most of the people involved were long retired, some deceased. But 10 days later, she received a brown envelope. No return address, no department seal, just the words, "For your records," typed on the front. Inside were photocopies of pages from a precinct activity ledger, dated February 2000. The entries were handwritten and erratic. They included names of locations in Red Hook, Gowanus, and the industrial docks, areas far outside Ronnie's assigned patrol route. One note, marked with a crude star, read, "Met with M and J, warned not to talk, pushed back, said he was done covering." Another read, "Following the wrong man. If he vanishes, we'll all be blamed." There were initials signed at the bottom. R.S. Alvarez stared at the pages for hours. She wasn't sure who sent them. She wasn't sure who M or J were. But it was clear. Ronnie had stumbled onto something internal, something dangerous. And then there was one final sheet. A blurry copy of a photograph, black and white, slightly angled. It showed Ronnie standing on the far end of the bridge, next to 2 other men. One of them, Alvarez recognized instantly, a former lieutenant who had quietly retired in early 2001. The other, she had to research. He wasn't police. He was a contractor tied to city surveillance infrastructure. Robbie never saw the photograph. He had disconnected almost entirely. Cold Spring had become a sort of sanctuary. He lived in a modest cabin near the river, spent his mornings walking wooded trails. Occasionally he helped out at a local garage, changing tires or fixing up old bikes. He never spoke about the city. He rarely mentioned Ronnie. But one morning, a letter arrived. No return address, no signature. Just a short note, handwritten in a blocky, steady hand. "You weren't wrong. He didn't fall. He was pushed to disappear. We couldn't stop it. We just buried it. I'm sorry." There was no name, no date. But Robbie didn't need more. He didn't call Alvarez, didn't try to track the sender. The letter didn't bring anger. It brought confirmation, the echo of something he had always known, but never been able to prove, that Ronnie's disappearance wasn't accidental. It wasn't voluntary. It was engineered. And yet, the truth didn't feel like justice. There would be no trial, no arrests. Too much time had passed. Too many hands had changed. Evidence had decayed. Records had vanished. And the few responsible were likely beyond reach, legally or physically. But still, truth mattered. In late autumn, Alvarez published a quiet internal memo within the precinct. Re-evaluation of case file, 100 BR 215. Officer Ronald S. Smith. It included a summary of the newly recovered note, the jacket, and the anonymous documents. While no action could be taken formally, she requested that his name be moved from presumed missing to presumed non-voluntary disappearance under suspicious circumstances. It was a bureaucratic phrase, but for Robbie, it was the closest thing to justice he'd ever receive. Back in Cold Spring, he read the letter again, folded it and placed it inside the back cover of The Natural, the same book Ronnie had been reading the week he disappeared. He wrote on the inside flap, "He knew the truth. He never let go of it, and neither did I." One evening in November, Robbie stood by the edge of the river, the sky turning orange over the water. He held the baseball in his hand, tossing it once, twice, then a third time. He caught it, then set it gently on a flat rock by the shore. He didn't walk away. He just stood there for a long while, not thinking, not mourning, just being. The river moved on, and so did he. Cold Spring was quiet in winter. Snow lined the trails Robbie walked every morning. The river, his river now, flowed slower beneath sheets of thinning ice. The trees stood bare, like bones reaching into fog, and in that silence, something unfamiliar had begun to take root in him. Stillness, not the frozen kind that follows tragedy, not the suffocating stillness of grief or obsession, but the kind that comes after release, the kind that comes when you stop trying to fill silence with questions. He no longer brought the baseball to the riverbank. He didn't need to flip it anymore. Instead, he began writing. Not much, not for anyone else. Just brief pages he tucked into an old leather journal, entries titled with dates that meant nothing to anyone but him. January 12th. He laughed that night about the pigeons on the wire, said they had better posture than me. February 14th. The bridge didn't take him, people did, but the river kept him, gave him back. March 3rd. For the first time in 20 years I made coffee and didn't think about how he took it. He never showed these to anyone, but writing them felt like stitching, like every word helped rethread something torn long ago. Back in the city, the precinct quietly restored Ronnie Smith's photograph to the wall of service. No ceremony, no press, just a frame, cleaned and straightened. Underneath, a single line added in smaller font. Service ended, February 14th, 2000. Remembered with honor. Alvarez kept a copy of the letter Robbie had received. She stored it in a locked drawer alongside her retirement papers. She knew the department would never officially pursue the names in those old documents. Time had a way of sterilizing old sins. But she'd made peace with that, the same way Robbie had, by preserving the truth quietly, completely. Some weeks later, Alvarez drove upstate. She didn't call ahead. She didn't bring a badge. Just a worn folder and a brown bag with 2 cups of coffee. She found Robbie sitting outside a bookstore flipping through a paperback. He looked older, grayer, but lighter somehow, as if years had been shaved from his shoulders. When he saw her, he gave a small nod, not surprised. They didn't talk about the documents, or the note, or the photograph. She handed him the coffee. He handed her the book. It was the natural. Inside, a folded piece of paper. One line. He didn't get justice, but he got peace, that's something. Alvarez didn't say anything. She simply held the book close, then walked back to her car. Robbie watched her leave, then returned to his bench. He wasn't watching for anything anymore. He just liked being where the light hit the snow in long, quiet beams, where the air didn't hum with unfinished stories. He still missed Ronnie every single day. The shape of the absence never changed, but the sharpness had dulled. The questions had settled. One evening, a boy from the nearby town came up to him. "You're the man from the story, aren't you?" Robbie looked at him, confused. "My grandpa said you're the twin, the one who never stopped looking." Robbie smiled faintly. "Guess I am." The boy sat next to him, quiet for a while, then asked, "Did you find him?" Robbie looked out over the water, took a long breath, then said, "I didn't need to." The boy didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. That night, Robbie returned home. On his desk was the final letter he'd written to Ronnie, unfinished. He picked it up, stared at the empty space below the last sentence, and set his pen down beside it. There was nothing left to write. He folded the page gently and slid it into the back of the journal. Outside, the wind moved through the branches with a soft rustle. Somewhere in the woods, snow fell from a tree limb in one silent sheet. Robbie sat in his chair by the window, eyes closed, not sleeping, just quiet. And for the first time since that February morning in 2000, that silence no longer frightened him. It held him. He had not reclaimed his brother, but he had reclaimed himself. And that was enough.